The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Chicago penthouse at the Meridian, a perfect backdrop for a quiet Tuesday evening. Daniel Foster stood in the dim kitchen, pouring a vintage Cabernet, while the faint sound of his wife's shower echoed down the hall. Everything felt secure, built on a foundation of elite corporate success. Then, Evelyn's phone illuminated on the marble counter. It wasn't a text, but a push notification from an encrypted financial app he had never seen before. Monthly transfer to C.H. completed. Thanks for the hotel. The secure walls of Daniel's perfect marriage instantly turned into a cage of hidden lies. If you enjoy stories exploring the dark, hidden corners of human relationships and the heavy price of betrayal, subscribe to our channel and walk with us through this unfolding tragedy. The heavy rain of a Chicago autumn hammered against the glass walls of their penthouse at the Meridian. 70 floors above the glowing arteries of downtown, the apartment was a sanctuary of minimalist luxury and cold, calculated perfection. Daniel Foster stood in the shadowy kitchen, the crystal stem of a wine glass pinched between his fingers. He poured a generous measure of Cabernet, listening to the muffled, rhythmic hum of the shower running in the master bathroom. His wife, Evelyn Brooks, a senior partner at Bennett & Hayes, had just returned from a supposed late-night deposition. She was a woman of sharp edges and flawless composure, someone who built ironclad defenses for multinational corporations and herself. Daniel loved the formidable armor she wore, assuming it protected them both. As he reached for the wine bottle, a sudden pulse of blue light caught his eye. Evelyn's phone, left carelessly on the edge of the dark marble island, vibrated. Daniel usually never looked. Trust was the silent currency of their 7-year marriage. But the screen didn't show a standard text message or an email from her paralegal. It was a stark, black icon, an encrypted banking application he had never seen before. The notification banner lingered for just 3 seconds. Vault alert. Transfer of $5,000 to C.H. completed. Memo. Thanks for the hotel. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The kitchen suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. He stared at the glowing screen until it faded to black, his mind racing through the catalog of their shared expenses, their joint accounts, their transparent financial lives. There was no C.H. There was no vault. Footsteps padded softly against the hardwood floor. Evelyn emerged from the hallway, wrapped in a plush white robe, her damp hair clinging to her neck. She carried the faint, sharp scent of expensive hotel soap, not the lavender wash she kept in their shower. "Is the wine breathing?" she asked, her voice a smooth, tired drawl as she walked past him, smoothly slipping her phone off the counter and into her pocket without breaking stride. "Who is C.H.?" Daniel asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. Evelyn stopped. Her spine stiffened for a fraction of a second before she turned around, her expression an unreadable mask of mild confusion. "What are you talking about, Dan?" "A notification popped up," he said, keeping his eyes locked on hers, searching for the micro-tremors of panic. $5,000. For a hotel. From an app I've never seen. Evelyn let out a soft, dismissive sigh, stepping closer to take the wine glass from his hand. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving his. "It's nothing, Daniel. Just Chad Hunter, an old friend from law school. He's in severe debt, going through a messy divorce. The firm put him up in a hotel temporarily, and I fronted the cash off the books. I didn't want to worry you with his pathetic drama." She smiled, a practiced, perfect curve of her lips. "It was nothing." She walked past him toward the living room, leaving a trail of foreign soap scent in her wake. Daniel stood frozen. He looked down at the marble counter where her coat lay draped over a stool. Protruding slightly from the inner pocket was a thick, silver keycard bearing the gold crest of the Rosewood Country Club, a place neither of them held a membership. The mahogany walls of Daniel's office at Bennett & Hayes felt more like a bunker than a sanctuary. It was 6 a.m., hours before the first associates would arrive, but he had not slept. The Chicago skyline beyond his window was a sprawling grid of indifferent lights, mirroring the cold calculus currently running through his mind. On his pristine glass desk sat a single object, the silver keycard from the Rosewood Country Club. He had slipped it from Evelyn's coat pocket while she slept, a silent theft that marked the end of their marriage's presumed innocence. Evelyn was a master litigator. Confronting her with just a keycard and a fleeting glance at an app notification would be procedural suicide. She would spin a plausible defense, gaslight him into apologizing, and then meticulously bury the trail. If Daniel was going to war with his wife, he needed discovery. He needed irrefutable proof. He booted up his secure terminal and bypassed the firm's standard network, logging into a private server he reserved for delicate corporate intelligence. He typed out a brief, encrypted message to Kevin Walsh, an independent forensic accountant who owed Daniel his career. Need a deep dive. Off the books. Subject, Chad Hunter. Cross-reference with Rosewood Country Club, Chicago. While he waited, Daniel drank bitter, day-old coffee, letting the caffeine fuel the hollow burning in his chest. He thought about Evelyn's voice last night, smooth, unwavering, devoid of any guilt. It was nothing. The phrase echoed in his head, a taunt masquerading as reassurance. He remembered the early years of their marriage, the way she used to look at him before the partnership tracks, and the relentless billable hours consumed their lives. Had the distance between them been a breeding ground for this? Or had she always been capable of such flawless deception? At 7:15 a.m., his monitor chimed softly. A secure file dropped into his inbox from Kevin. Daniel opened the PDF. It wasn't just a background check. It was a financial autopsy. Chad Hunter was indeed a former law school classmate, but there was no messy divorce. Chad was unmarried, currently employed as a mid-level consultant, and living quite comfortably. Then came the transaction logs. The $5,000 transfer Daniel had witnessed wasn't a one-time charitable loan. It was a monthly retainer. Kevin had managed to pull the ledger attached to a Shell LLC tied to Chad. The deposits perfectly aligned with the dates of Evelyn's overnight depositions in the suburbs. But it was the final attachment that made Daniel's blood turn to ice. It was an itemized folio from the Rosewood Country Club's private suites. The receipts detailed multiple weekend stays, couples massages, and room service orders for two, always billed to a corporate card masked under a dummy account Evelyn controlled. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. A charge for a bottle of Bollinger champagne and a dozen oysters, signed for not by Chad Hunter, but in Evelyn's distinct, looping handwriting. Daniel stared at the signature, realizing the woman sleeping in his bed was a stranger. The ambient lighting of the Sapphire Lounge was designed to flatter, casting everything in a warm, amber glow that usually softened Evelyn's sharp features. Tonight, sitting across the small mahogany table, the illumination only made her look as though she were sculpted from cold brass. A jazz pianist played a low, meandering melody in the corner, masking the quiet hum of Chicago's elite negotiating over expensive martinis. Daniel swirled the scotch in his glass, letting the weight of the heavy crystal ground his fraying nerves. "I ran into an old colleague today," Daniel lied, his voice a smooth, casual drawl over the rim of his glass. "Someone from your law school class, actually." Evelyn did not freeze. Her training as a senior litigator was too deeply ingrained. Instead, she took a deliberate, measured sip of her gin gimlet, her eyes locking onto his with polite, manufactured interest. "Oh, who?" "Chad Hunter," Daniel said, dropping the name into the space between them like a stone in a dark well. For a fraction of a second, the rhythm of her breathing hitched. It was a micro-expression, a slight tightening of the muscles around her jawline that a stranger would miss entirely. But Daniel had spent 7 years studying the geography of her face. "Really?" Evelyn replied, her tone perfectly modulated to convey mild surprise. She set her glass down, aligning it precisely with the gold rim of her coaster. "I thought you didn't know him. Did he have the nerve to ask you for money?" "No," Daniel said, leaning back into the plush velvet booth, maintaining eye contact. He looked remarkably well for a man going through a crushing, messy divorce. In fact, he looked like a man without a single care in the world. He mentioned something about spending a lot of time out near the Rosewood Country Club. Said the room service there is exceptional. The silence that followed was dense, pressing heavily against the ambient noise of the crowded lounge. Evelyn's fingers, adorned with the flawless 3-carat diamond he had placed there, gave a singular, involuntary twitch against the table. Daniel remembered seeing that exact same twitch 5 years ago, during a weekend trip to Boston. A trip where she had inexplicably vanished for 6 hours, blaming a sudden crisis with a managing partner. Watching her now, a sickening realization began to take root in his mind. The seamless, breathtaking way she compartmentalized her lies felt heavily practiced. It was far too smooth for a first-time transgression. The chilling thought lingered. Was Chad Hunter an anomaly, or merely the current chapter in a much longer history of deception? "Rosewood," she finally said, offering a dismissive laugh that sounded just half a pitch too bright. He must be trying to impress a new client. Chad always was a desperate social climber. She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Her skin was freezing. "Let's not waste our rare evening together talking about my charity cases, Dan. We have better things to focus on." Daniel looked down at her hand, feeling the sharp edges of her diamond bite into his skin, then looked up into her dark, unblinking eyes. He smiled, feeling the steel-trapped jaws opening beneath them both. "You're right, Evelyn. We have so much to focus on." The heavy oak door of Daniel's home study clicked shut, locking him in a fortress of leather-bound volumes and oppressive silence. It was 2 a.m. Evelyn was asleep in the master bedroom, her breathing a steady, rhythmic metronome of feigned innocence. Daniel knelt before the steel floor safe hidden beneath a heavy Persian rug. The combination, their wedding anniversary, felt like a sick, twisted joke as he spun the cold metal dial. He extracted a thick manila envelope, its seal unbroken since the day they signed it 7 years ago. Inside lay their prenuptial agreement, a 70-page document drafted when their marriage was still a promising calculation of merging assets. He spread the crisp, white pages across his mahogany desk, the amber light of his reading lamp illuminating the dense legalese. He flipped directly to Section 4, Paragraph B, the morality clause. It was an ironclad stipulation that Evelyn herself had fiercely negotiated, ironically to protect her own rapidly ascending career from any potential scandal. In the event of documented infidelity by either party, the at-fault individual unconditionally forfeits all claims to the marital estate, shared equity in Bennett and Hayes, and is subject to a punitive liquidation of specified personal assets. It was a corporate death sentence. If he triggered it, he wouldn't just divorce her. He would strip her of the only thing she truly revered, her wealth, her firm equity, and her flawless reputation. As he traced the lines of ink, his finger paused on a subtle, obscure amendment added during their 2nd year of marriage. It was a retroactive shield concerning unspecified personal liabilities, slipped into the contract right after Evelyn's sudden, unexplained month-long mental health sabbatical to Miami. Daniel's stomach tightened. He remembered her cold, distant demeanor back then, the phantom phone calls at midnight, the sudden change in her perfume, the visceral disconnect when she finally returned. He had been naive enough to believe it was just severe burnout. Looking at the legal amendment now, a chilling pattern crystallized in his mind. The slick, breathtaking way she had lied about Chad Hunter at the lounge wasn't a new skill. It was a refined technique. Miami hadn't been burnout. It had been a rehearsal. Daniel closed the leather-bound folder. The legal framework for her destruction was securely in his hands, but Section 4 demanded undeniable, physical proof. Financial ledgers and obscure hotel receipts were circumstantial. Evelyn could effortlessly argue them away as confidential business expenses. He needed her caught. He picked up a prepaid phone he had purchased with cash earlier that afternoon. He dialed a Chicago area code Kevin had strictly recommended, a private intelligence contractor who specialized in high-stakes matrimonial espionage. "I have a target," Daniel whispered into the receiver, his eyes fixed on the closed hallway door. "Evelyn Brooks. I need photographic confirmation, timestamps, and physical evidence. Do whatever it takes, but she cannot feel a ripple." A low, gravelly voice on the other and simply asked for the addresses. Daniel ended the call and sat in the quiet dark, the prenuptial agreement resting on his desk like a loaded weapon. The point of no return had been crossed. The secure envelope arrived at Daniel's office precisely at 7 a.m., delivered by a nondescript courier who bypassed the firm's front desk entirely. It lay on his glass desk, heavy and unbranded, containing the distilled ruin of his marriage. Daniel sat in his leather chair, the Chicago skyline outside his window obscured by a thick, oppressive fog. He reached for the brass letter opener, his hand remarkably steady for a man about to watch his life burn down. He sliced the heavy paper, pulling out a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs and a black flash drive. The first image was a long-lens shot of Evelyn at a secluded table in a high-end steakhouse. She was leaning across the white tablecloth, her hand resting intimately over Chad Hunter's. The second photo was taken 40 minutes later in the dimly lit lobby of the Rosewood Country Club. Chad's hand was resting firmly on the small of her back as she leaned in, her lips pressed against his neck. The camera had captured the micro-expressions Daniel knew so well. The relaxed slope of her shoulders, the unguarded, authentic smile she hadn't given him in years. The visual confirmation was a physical blow, a cold, jagged rock settling deep in his stomach. But it was the flash drive that held the true devastation. Daniel plugged it into his secure terminal, pulling up a series of intercepted text transcripts and a single audio file. The investigator had managed to clone a secondary burner phone Evelyn kept hidden in her gym locker. Daniel clicked on the first transcript. The messages weren't the passionate exchanges of lovers. They were cold, transactional, and tinged with desperation. Evelyn, the $5,000 cleared. You need to stop calling my primary line. Dan asked about the app. Chad, tell Dan whatever you want. Eve. But the price goes up next month. $10K. Or I send him the Miami photos. Evelyn, you piece of shit. We had a deal. Chad, deals change when the firm promotes you to senior partner. I need the cash, and you need your pristine reputation. Friday. Daniel's blood ran cold. He stared at the screen, the glowing text burning into his retinas. The $5,000 wasn't a retainer for an affair, it was extortion. Chad Hunter wasn't just a lover, he was a parasite. And the mention of Miami, the word hit Daniel with the force of a physical strike. It confirmed his worst suspicion from the night he read their prenuptial agreement. Miami wasn't a mental health sabbatical. It was the original sin, the first affair, and Chad had the leverage. Evelyn wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a cornered animal, frantically paying off a blackmailer to protect her ascension to senior partner. Daniel leaned back, the silence of his office ringing in his ears. The revelation shifted the entire battlefield. Evelyn's pristine armor was cracking under the weight of her own secrets. She was vulnerable, bleeding cash to keep her past buried while maintaining the flawless facade of their marriage. He looked at the glossy photos of his wife kissing her blackmailer. The anger that had been simmering within him crystallized into a dark, absolute clarity. He wasn't just going to divorce her. He was going to use Chad Hunter's extortion against her, ensuring that when the floor finally gave way, Evelyn would have absolutely nothing left to hold on to. The glass-walled conference room at Bennett and Hayes felt more like an execution chamber than a boardroom. It was 10 a.m. on a Friday, the high-stakes hour when the equity partners convened to review the quarterly revenue and client acquisitions. Daniel Foster sat near the head of the long mahogany table, his posture relaxed, a dark, expensive suit perfectly tailored to project unwavering confidence. Across the table sat his wife, Evelyn Brooks, the firm's golden child. She was presenting a slide deck on a massive merger she had just successfully closed, her voice a precise, melodic cadence of ambition and intelligence. Daniel watched her flawlessly dissect complex financial structures, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of her face and the 3-carat diamond on her left hand. To the rest of the partners, she was an unstoppable force of corporate litigation. To Daniel, she was a house of cards waiting for the wind. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and rested his hand against his phone. He had spent the last 48 hours setting up a sophisticated, untraceable encrypted email server. The recipient list included the 12 senior partners currently in the room, the managing director, and the firm's ethics compliance board. Evelyn clicked to the final slide, a triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth. And that, gentlemen, is how we secure an additional 40 million in billable hours for the fiscal year. A murmur of genuine approval rippled around the table. The managing partner, an imposing man named Arthur Sterling, nodded deeply. Exceptional work, Evelyn. Your track record remains spotless. Daniel caught Evelyn's eye across the table. He smiled, a thin, polite expression that didn't reach his eyes. She offered a brief, triumphant nod in return. Beneath the table, Daniel hit send on his phone. 10 seconds later, the rhythmic, synchronized buzzing of a dozen cell phones cut through the low applause. Arthur Sterling paused, his thick brow furrowing as he pulled his device from his pocket. Around the table, partners stopped murmuring. The room descended into an abrupt, unnatural silence as eyes dropped to the glowing screens. Daniel watched the blood drain from Evelyn's face. She didn't need to check her phone. The sudden, horrified silence from the men who had just been praising her was enough. Evelyn. Arthur Sterling's voice was suddenly cold. The warmth of his earlier compliment entirely vanished. He placed his phone flat on the mahogany table, pushing it slightly toward the center. What exactly is an encrypted shell company registered to a Chad Hunter? And why does this anonymous dossier show an ongoing series of monthly $5,000 transfers originating from a masked Bennett and Hayes expense account you oversee? The silence that followed was dense, crushing, and absolute. Every eye in the room pivoted from Arthur to Evelyn. Daniel remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his leather chair, watching the flawless armor of his wife shatter under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. Evelyn stared at Arthur's phone, her mouth slightly parted, the color of her skin turning to ash. The dossier Daniel had sent didn't just expose the payments. It highlighted the gross misuse of firm resources, framing it not as an affair, but as corporate embezzlement and a severe ethical violation. Evelyn's voice faltered, a desperate whisper in a room that demanded roaring competence. For the first time in their 7-year marriage, Daniel Foster watched his wife lose an argument before she even opened her mouth. The penthouse at the Meridian was engulfed in a suffocating, heavy silence. It was past midnight. The spectacular implosion at Bennett and Hayes had taken hours to process. The equity partners had suspended Evelyn pending a full forensic audit and an emergency ethics review. Daniel had walked out of the towering glass building feeling the cold, intoxicating rush of absolute victory. But as he stepped into the dark expanse of their living room, that victory instantly turned to ash in his mouth. Evelyn was already there. She sat in the velvet armchair by the floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the glowing city grid. She wasn't packing a suitcase. She wasn't weeping. She was slowly swirling a glass of neat bourbon, her posture radiating the terrifying stillness of a viper coiled to strike. "You missed your calling, Dan," she murmured, her voice carrying through the dark room without a single tremor. "Corporate espionage suits you far better than corporate law." The anonymous server routing the dossier through Switzerland was a nice touch. But you always did overcomplicate your traps. Daniel unbuttoned his suit jacket, feeling a sudden, primal spike of adrenaline. He refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "You embezzled firm funds to pay off a blackmailer, Evelyn. The trap wasn't complicated. You just walked right into it, blinded by your own arrogance." She let out a low, dry laugh that scraped against his nerves like rusted metal. She set the crystal glass on the side table and stood up. She didn't look defeated. She looked utterly liberated. The heavy, flawless mask of the perfect corporate wife she had worn for 7 years was finally gone, revealing something sharp, wounded, and entirely ruthless underneath. "Did you really think I would just let you trigger Section 4 of our prenup and walk away with everything?" Evelyn walked slowly toward the marble kitchen island. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, dropping it onto the counter with a heavy thud. "You spent so much time looking into my shadows. You forgot who helped bury yours." Daniel froze, his eyes locked on the worn leather cover. He recognized it instantly, and a cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. It was the physical ledger from the Mitchell Healthcare settlement 5 years ago, the massive class action lawsuit that had officially secured his own partnership. That ledger was destroyed, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, breathless whisper. You asked me to destroy it, Evelyn corrected smoothly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. Because if the ethics board knew you intentionally buried the adverse toxicology reports to force a lowball settlement, you wouldn't just be disbarred, Dan. You would be facing federal prison for fraud and jury tampering. I kept it. A little insurance policy against the day you decided your ego was bigger than our marriage. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Daniel's feet. The moral high ground he had stood upon all day vanished, replaced by the dizzying realization of his own impending ruin. She hadn't just anticipated his move. She had been holding a loaded gun to his head for half a decade. If you leak that, you go down with me for conspiracy, he countered, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. I'm already going down, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a dark, triumphant malice. My career is over. You made sure of that this morning. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. But you? You have your pristine reputation, your partnership, your freedom. She walked closer, stopping just inches from him. The scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the sharp tang of bourbon. And since we are finally laying all our cards on the table, let's clear up your pathetic, obsessive misunderstanding about Chad Hunter. Daniel's jaw tightened. The photos were clear, Evelyn. I heard the audio. He was extorting you for the hotel rooms. He was extorting me, she agreed, tilting her head slightly. But Chad wasn't my lover, Daniel. Chad was the private investigator I hired 3 years ago during my sabbatical in Miami. Daniel's brow furrowed, a cold dread seeping deep into his veins. What are you talking about? You arrogant fool, she whispered, a cruel smile curling her lips. Chad didn't find out about an affair. He found out about the other one. Miami wasn't a mental health break. Miami was a man named Julian, a brilliant architect, someone who actually looked at me when he spoke, who didn't view our lives as a balance sheet. I loved him. We spent a month together in a villa overlooking the water. It was the most alive I have felt in my entire miserable existence for you. She paused, letting the revelation sink its hooks deep into Daniel's chest. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Chad wasn't the affair. Chad was the parasite who had discovered the first affair. This was the second time she had betrayed him. The entire foundation of their marriage hadn't just been cracked. It had been rotting from the inside out for years. Julian died of a sudden aneurysm 2 years ago, Evelyn continued, her voice briefly losing its venom, replaced by a raw, hollow grief that made her look suddenly very old. I was utterly broken, and you didn't even notice. You just complained that I wasn't billing enough hours. Chad figured it out. He found the hotel records, the flights, the private emails of a dead man. He's been bleeding me dry ever since to keep the ghost of Julian a secret. She stepped back, her eyes hardening once more into obsidian. So, yes, I paid him. I paid him to protect the only beautiful thing I had left in my life from being dragged through a divorce court by a hypocrite like you. But now the secret is out. Evelyn tapped her manicured fingernail against the cover of the Mitchell Healthcare ledger. I am going to burn this entire life to the ground, Daniel. And you are going to sit right in the center of the flames with me. The conference room at Bennett and Hayes was a ghost of its former glory. 6 months had passed since the morning Daniel Foster detonated his marriage in front of the entire equity board. The heavy mahogany table, once the stage for their corporate conquests, now felt like a polished tombstone. The Chicago winter howled against the reinforced glass, casting a pale, unforgiving light across the room. Daniel sat at one end, his sharp suit replaced by a simple, charcoal overcoat that hung slightly loose on his frame. The stress of the ensuing investigations had carved deep, hollow shadows beneath his eyes. Across from him sat Evelyn Brooks. The devastating elegance she once weaponized was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened shell. She wore no makeup, and her hands, resting flat against the table, were bare. The flawless 3-carat diamond had been pawned months ago to cover a fraction of the staggering legal fees they had both incurred. Between them lay a single, manila folder containing the final decree of dissolution of marriage. The fallout had been apocalyptic. The moment Evelyn realized Daniel intended to follow through with the morality clause of their prenuptial agreement, she made good on her threat. The Mitchell Healthcare ledger was leaked anonymously to the State Ethics Board and the Department of Justice. The resulting explosion had not only obliterated Daniel's partnership, but had triggered a sweeping federal audit of Bennett and Hayes. In a desperate bid for survival, the firm had severed ties with both of them, freezing their assets and publicly disavowing their actions. Their sprawling penthouse at the Meridian had been seized by creditors. The luxury cars, the offshore accounts, the carefully curated illusion of their perfect lives, all of it had been consumed by the fire they had set to destroy each other. Daniel stared at the thick stack of papers. The legal jargon was a sterile autopsy of a 7-year war disguised as a marriage. He picked up the heavy brass, pen resting beside the folder. It felt as cold as the ice forming on the windows outside. "We really did it, didn't we?" Daniel's voice was a dry, raspy whisper, breaking the heavy silence of the room. He didn't look up from the signature line. Evelyn didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the gray skyline, her expression an impenetrable mask of exhaustion. "We did exactly what we were trained to do, Daniel. We litigated until there was nothing left to fight over." The bitter truth of her words settled into the space between them. Daniel had spent years hunting for the truth of her betrayals. First Julian, then Chad Hunter's extortion, believing that exposing her would bring him vindication. He had thought that burning away her lies would leave him standing tall in the ashes. Instead, he had only exposed his own corruption, proving that his hands were just as filthy as hers. He thought about the night he first saw the encrypted notification on her phone. He remembered the arrogant certainty he felt when he downloaded the photos of her and Chad. He had been so consumed by the need to win, to punish her for breaking the unspoken contract of their lives, that he never stopped to consider the cost of total war. With a slow, deliberate motion, Daniel uncapped the pen. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment sounded deafening in the quiet room. He signed his name, the looping letters severing the final legal tie that bound them together. He pushed the folder across the polished mahogany. Evelyn didn't immediately reach for it. She finally turned her head, looking at him not with the burning hatred of their last confrontation, but with a profound, hollow emptiness. The ghost of the woman he had married was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger broken by her own secrets and his relentless vengeance. She picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, just slightly, before she pressed it to the paper. As she signed, a single tear, a silent, jagged manifestation of everything they had lost, escaped her eye and fell onto the page, bleeding into the wet ink of her signature. She closed the folder with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the massive, empty room, a final gavel striking against the ruin of their lives. Evelyn stood up, her overcoat wrapping tightly around her thin frame. She didn't look back at the table. She walked slowly toward the heavy glass doors, the sound of her heels fading into the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. Daniel sat alone in the dim light, staring at the blurred ink on the divorce decree. He had sought absolute revenge, meticulously planning the destruction of the woman who had betrayed him. He had wanted her to pay the ultimate price for her lies. He touched the cold, brass pen one last time before dropping it onto the table. The silence of the room wrapped around him, heavy and suffocating. "We won exactly what we deserved, nothing."